things. What do you think, Steve? Well, we can't have nice things. Well, then Steve A-hole.
I try.
I mean, I can fill in hand by hand if y'all prefer.
You are the worst.
Way to go, blue boy.
Watch you.
Way to be title.
Is there intimidation?
Sorry. He's your intimidation. Just staring down.
I'm terrified of blue boys.
Does this mean I get to wrestle Tyler White and the winner wins?
Yesterday I threatened David Bowers to vote for us, and then he didn't vote for us. So it's theory.
I'll give you guys each 30 speaker points if you let that wrestling match happen to determine the ballot.
I'll give just.
I'm okay with it. I think I'll take our weight class advantage.
I'm okay with that too.
I think I do it. There's a lot of this issue.
I mean, I would have to get a
As long
mark
as
Tyler
Tyler
last
last
time for
time,
round
it's not gonna
one. I think he's good to go, actually.
Just you know,
As long as I can get quickly to the throat.
I don't know if I would ever bet on Jeff's athletic.
You guys have extra paper?
No, I'm just betting on the ability
Yeah, I have
for him to sit on and suffocate blue boy.
I will take anyone in the building in an ice skating race.
I'll take this.
I'm gonna take the wrestler.
No, you will not.
You're a little less aerodynamic than you used to be.
I could form.
I feel like I could win an ice skating race.
0% chance.
I figure skating.
I'm
Definitely check
Whoa,
him into the board.
It's almost been in the circle.
The enforcer versus the figure skater. I'm down to watch it.
I mean, I already saw that Mighty Ducks movie.
I was just about to say.
She was fucking badass.
She didn't get in the whole movie. All she did was be a distraction while other people did the real.
She was a real
That's
stick in the
lame.
mud.
Didn't she say it once?
Alright, just so we're clear, it was a boy. Kenny Wu is a boy.
Yeah, but in the first movie it was Tammy Duncan, dog.
Yeah.
Tommy and Tammy Duncan. Danny Tamborelli.
You're so right.
Was the first one. Don't tell me the Mighty
Yeah,
Ducks.
she was
But it was, however, Luis Mendoza that was the fast one that couldn't stop. So let's see
I don't know
how Jeff
shit about
does up.
Venezuela, but I know a lot about the Mighty Ducks.
Don't we all?
Alright.
Alright.
We good? Alright. Judges ready? You guys good? Alright.
Observation 1 is a resolution. The United States State Department should substantially increase its diplomatic engagement with Venezuela. Observation 2's background. 1, Venezuela's state-run oil company is horribly in debt to China. They currently owe them $34 billion because of their loan debt. 2, China is denying Venezuela future loans because of this. They literally laughed at them because of when Venezuela had requested a $110 billion loan request. Additionally, they are partially trying to repay them in oil exports, but but China wants a more efficient way for Venezuela to get oil, which means that this really isn't proving to be a very effective way to pay them back. Thus, the following plan. The United States State Department will substantially increase its diplomatic engagement with Venezuela by formally offering for the United States federal government to repay the $34 billion in loans owed by Venezuela's state-operated PDVSA oil company to the People's Republic of China. Again, the United States State Department will substantially increase its diplomatic engagement with Venezuela by formally offering for the United States federal government to repay the $34 billion in loans owed by Venezuela's state-operated PDVSA oil company to the People's Republic of China. Observation 3 is Solvency 1. Venezuela will say yes to the offer. Their oil production has decreased 25% in the status quo, which is at a decade of exports. Because of this investment is drastically decreasing their oil investment because it seems unstable, because their oil company seems extremely unstable because of the loans that they own them, which means that they would want to have a chance to increase investment. 2, Venezuela say yes to increase economic ties with the United States. The United States investment in Venezuela oil is at a 9-year low in 2012, which means they would want to increase U.S. oil imports. 3, Maduro will say yes to increase its legitimacy. He said that the economy is going to be his number one issue in the campaign, and that this would alleviate 1/3 of all Venezuelan debt, and 27% of the population are currently in poverty. So they'd say yes. Advantage 1 is Venezuelan economy. A's uniqueness 1. Venezuela oil profits are being hindered in the status quo because of the massive repayment. A, there's not enough money going back to the government. 45% of the federal budget is due to the state-run oil company, and currently 95 million barrels of oil go to China, but 1/3 of this China literally gets for free because of the oil deal. B, that there's not enough money going in further production to oil facilities. They're not allowed. They cannot expand facilities and production in the status quo because of the amount of debt they have, which means they can't access $513 billion of unrecoverable oil right now. Too, this has put them on the brink of collapse. Their unemployment has decreased. Unemployment has actually increased 6%, not decreased. It's increased 6% in the status quo. Additionally, the GDP has fell 1.7%, which means that they are on the brink. They are on the brink right now. 3, 3. The government has cut social spending because of this. 3 million people who rely on Venezuelan government social services for food in the status quo in Venezuela made their first cuts in over 5 years because of this. Via the impacts, one state can say the people will starve because of this. You can cross out 3 million people rely on food aid in a world in which they have to continue to cut social services. That puts these people on the ring, which means they die in a matter of months. Too. Venezuela economy is going to collapse because they're not able to pay off the loans. It means that it means that they're not able to pay off other loans or get any other loans from any other countries, which means that they're not able, which means that puts them in a pretty big hole, which means that they will not be able to have an economy anymore. For 3, this is going to lead to civil war. There's currently political instability in the status quo. Half the country wants to continue 21st century socialism, which is what Chavez did. The other one wants a completely free market in the world in which the economy was to break down. These two parties would go to war, which caused millions of people in Venezuela to die. See, the Psalm team wanted increase in oil profits, increase in profits from oil. We would literally give them the money in order for them. They would no longer have to give 1/3 of the amount of money they go to China for free. For free, which means that they would be able to increase profits from the oil too. This also speeds completion of the production because the profit split in social services and the profit would be split in social services and building new facilities, which means that they would be able to access 530 billion barrels of oil right now, which they can't get in the status quo. 3, that also increase investment in the status quo because the oil company would seem more stable when they don't have this massive loan debt to China, which means that there's going to be more investment, which also solves the problem for the stable oil settles. Investors leads to lower bond rates, which makes that more measurable. Even if just the perception that the United States is going to pay for this means that people are going to have a perceived perception that Venezuela is going to have more revenue, which means that it's easier for them to borrow from other countries. Advantage to China's relations. Asian uniqueness. 1, use in China relations are low in the status quo. China's protest the United States refusal to not sell Taiwan F-16s. Also, there is a big dispute over Iran and Syrian status quo too. China views Venezuela as loans extremely toxic, and they want to move away in the status quo. They're not being repaid efficiently in the status quo, which is extremely frustrating China, and they want to move away. 3, China and Japan disputes over Senkaku Islands are having the status quo. Both lay claims over the islands because they want massive oil reserves, and also they have a historical significance to both of these countries. 4, the United States is from the mediating conflict status quo, but it's not successful. Trying to refuse any sort of U.S. participation because they think that they are just going to be just have Japan interest in mind. 5, the increase in militarization is happening in the status quo, which means a flashpoint for war. China has a huge navy fleet there in March 12th in Japan. In response, they want to have a permanent coast guard in the region, which means that this is literally a hotspot for war. The impacts won't continue build up, leads to conflict. Japan will go to war. In the world in which Japan actually puts this coast guard there, China will see this as a threat, which means they will have to strike essentially because Xi Jinping will want to see him as if he has a backbone because he's newly elected too. This means the United States has to go in because of security guarantees. We signed a treaty with them that says that we would do this. 3, war between the United States and China will lead to miscalculation and risk extinction within the world in which they both fight. Both people will not, China and Japan will not want to back down because it feels that this island is part of their sovereignty, especially in the scenario of a war, which means that any country can misinterpret a missile as a nuclear weapon, which would break the threshold. And in a world in which you have a nuclear war, the environment will no longer be sustainable because the amount of fallout that would happen would mean the Earth would be inhabitable and everything would die. See, Psalm 1, this would be an act of good faith by the United States with increased relations. We would literally pay off the $30 million loans, and you can cross why China wants to move away from Venezuela, which means China would really love this and increase relations too. That illustrates the State Department as a new framework of China, which means that which the State Department is the one that would negotiate the mediation between China and Japan in a world in which we are now seeing that the State Department has China's interest. They would go in and be able to mediate the conflict. 3, the plan reframes China as an economic ally as opposed to China as opposed to an economic rival in the status quo. This would be a reversal of all the WTO disputes we have in the status quo, which means that we actually want to work with their economy. 4, this is an just the act of offering, and the act of offering is going to solve this in the status quo. It's the mere act of saying that the United States wants to offer this money to China means that China would see the United States trying to move more closer to be allies. Additionally, Xi Jinping said that he's willing to compromise in the status quo, but because there is no mediator, this is absolutely impossible. Only in a world in which there's a mediator will this happen. But even if China doesn't go to negotiate signals to Japan, then we no longer unconditionally support them. The reason for Japan aggression is because they feel that the United States is always going to back them up against China in a world in which we have closer ties with China, even if they don't want to go to negotiations. Japan will never risk going to war because they feel that the United States is going to go away from them.
Jewell, y'all get a copy of this, but for the panel, here it is. These are copies of the intertexts for y'all to share.
They want my phone.
it should be obvious which one belongs with which.
No, those T-shells can look a lot like alternatives.
So it's gonna be 4 off in case of order.
Background included.
Yeah.
There's the floor.
Yep.
Thing is, it's the radius.
Everybody good?
Yeah.
Okay.
First is going to be top how to diplomatic engage. The 8 points of information diplomatically engage is the general process of public diplomacy, communication, and deployment of international aid. Everybody has a copy of the B points violation. You are not all 3 of these things. 6 points signals from one years, ground interpretations, keepers, even core, negative ground, the pigs, focus, disads, and strong links, politics, and return years, limits your interpretation, troubles, the number of affirmatives, which is devastating, predictable limits, the key to research depth, and strategic privilege at the NPTE, the East Point, Europe, service, education, I'll explain, but the next is going to be top how in Venezuela. Venezuela is a nation, and South America is distinct from China. The B point is the violation that you engage China, money straight there. It's 6 points here from around here, ground embassies, core ground, specific relations with Venezuela, and massively expansive farm ground here advantage to proof of the territorial years limits that infinitely delimits top. You include literally picketing action toward any act remotely connected with Venezuela, making negative research useless, and forcing callback on generic stories and bad these points, voters, fairness, education, all explained above, and operate the game for the game itself, and activity carry credibility just that. The case points that carry credibility is highly successful in 100 years when HRC was security of state. She made Asia a centerpiece of U.S. foreign policy and Asian pivot isolated, which is key to U.S. allies in the European Union. The return here is that William Crafton of Brookings Institute said the focus on China's surge during the past decade is closest continuing strength of the U.S.-EU, the continuing importance of that relationship, and return years that carry fixing the relationship with the EU took not nation trip, signaling his commitment to German Foreign Minister Westermont stated that this trip could begin alleviating the problems which emerged under Clinton that before years Kerry ignored the Latin American region barely. United during confirmation is not signaled anymore toward Latin America and the squad. The beast point is links that tanks his credibility to the one here is playing a massive trade-off with focused limited time, resources, and large-scale unpredictable initiation restrictions, amount of time and resources for Europe. The return here is the plan's massive priority shift long-term diplomatic focus perceives Latin America already impossible to rebuild the European ethics. Number 30 years since taking over the Madero has largely kept the United States meddling in elections, attempting to assassinate political fissure, and poisoning Chavez, seeking cooperation signals that Kerry will put up with anything and will be ignored, lied to, and taken advantage of. The 40 years the USD mistrust of Venezuela. They believe they manipulated the oil and gas economy to crush competitions, and Chavez was just repudiating the Western ideals. The cease points the impacts that NATO cohesion the war here as a result. The EU debt crisis, the raw austerity allies are considering large-scale defense cuts would jeopardize their national security. From turning years in the past, the United States NATO's main contributing system, including the United States cutting the EU, and so they had to pick up the slack. The number 30 years that now is key time in terms of convincing the European allies that the importance of strategic relationship and to invest will collapse because of financial and infighting. That in 40 years this key to our conflict. Literally tons of resources are there in Russian aggression in terms of the ability in order to get that only an ability to have a strong NATO alliance are able to stop Russian aggression, and that if they perceive that NATO is decreasing probably means that Russia lashes out. The next is going to be the Venezuela disad.
You good, Justin?
Okay. The ace of one here is the Madero is reaching out to the military and status quo. The one here is the Madero, and turned president and is the leading consideration in the special election, national month, and former union organizer, legislation, and foreign minister, handpicked by Chavez. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, sorry, it's about the other dissent. Why exactly does Kerry losing credibility disrupt every single EU cohesion?
Those are all of the links about the time, resources, and about how the EU particularly does not like the relationships with Venezuela.
Kerry is key.
Yes.
Kerry is
The next argument is that is zero military experience. He overstretched endorses from Chavez and won some key military figures. The East point here is the defense minister. Bolivia has endorsed the supporting the East point here is that Capella, who is the head of the National Assembly and foreign military officer, has also endorsed them. Third here is Madero kicked out 2 U.S. Air Force attachments and accused the United States of poisoning Chavez and attempting to assassinate his opponent. Number 4, and here's there's going to be a true smooth transition of power in the status quo. Madero has a 14-point lead in the polls and runs the state media as well as the state oil wealth. These points links that Madero's increased cooperation with the United States will equal a large military backlash. The one here's the plan is direct cooperation between the Madero and the United States, which signals that Madero is directly undermining Chavez's legacy by cooperating with his greatest enemy right after his death. This is particularly important because it looks like he is taking money from the United States government that he is in their pocket. That I'm 200 years. This follows include all the governors
governors, Venezuela's, 20 states, and 1/4 of Maduro's cabinet, who are all military officials, will probably have to backlash. The number 3 years, the coup has taken place in Venezuela in 91, 92, and 2002, all driven by fear that the United States is trying to insert its pro-Western leader. Maduro is challenging support by that West. There is no choice but to cooperate because his opponent is also pro-Western. It means they don't have any other option at these points. The impacts of the war years it turns case because it means the removal of Maduro from power and insurgent leader who violently opposed the United States. It probably means they don't have the ability to grow oil because there's a massive war going on there. The two argument here is that Colombia Maduro is the key figure in order mediating the peace talks between FARC and the Colombian government, proving the successful FARC selling off its legal access and its decrease in size by 40%. The military will end these negotiations and will increase the FARC's ability in order to wage war. The third argument here is the U.S. military bases in Colombia are center of the U.S. Southern Command. This is literally the tip of the spear for Latin America. When engagement happens there, the United States will have to get involved, and because of China's strategic interest, because of resources like they talked about, it probably means that it escalates to World War III with nuclear bombs. Everybody goes boom. The next is going to be on the land tax. The first argument is that they would say no. The first argument here is there has not been an ambassador exchange since 2010, and Maduro has highlighted he's going to continue the anti-U.S. policy. Probably means that he's not going to accept the money. The two argument here is the response to Chavez's death was poorly received. The White House didn't even give any condolences, which probably means that there is not a relationship between the United States and Venezuela and the squad. Number 3 argument here is, though, that Chavism is the political ideology that is happening there, and empirically they have rejected all U.S. engagement. The number 4 argument, though, is domestic focus. Is the U.S. has offered oil and narcotic prevention in the last 5 years. All have been denied. Probably a reason is why historically they have so, and particularly the continuing of that. The number 5 argument here is the U.S. effort failed in the 1990s in order to aid them, and will always fail. Colombia is an example of this in terms of Latin America. There has not been democratic promotion. The number 6 argument here, though, is that North Korea proved there is an irrecoverable leader, died, and expected a moderate leader to take its place, but instead the leader backlashed against the United States, and Maduro will do the same. And another example of this is in Uganda with Elim. The number 7 argument, though, is that Damon's political party is split. 80% are anti-American or anti-imperialist. The lack of U.S. action makes the anti-imperialist not relevant now, but the plan changed that because it's seen in us trying to take over them on their impacts. They say that people are going to be on the uniqueness. Sorry, they say that the Chinese critical argument is actually increased. The United States is now 40% of the total output, and the economy is actually increasing because global gas prices going up. This is in terms of the Labor Department. That's why production has decreased, because not that they don't have the means to do so, but just because they don't have to run the production facilities long because gas prices are going up. Probably means the economy will find the next in terms of the impact. They say they're relying on foreign aid now means they're starving. No reason whatsoever as to why foreign aid makes you starve. If you have food, you have food. Moreover, the IMF can give development funds. No reason as to why they wouldn't be able to solve. They also said that they will give 1/3 for free. This is only a one-time deal. It doesn't restructure the entire economy. The problem is it just causes a massive problem with sickle. They say there will still be some argument here that oil is the most in demand. There's no reason whatsoever as to why the perception of that would ever change. We use oil for literally everything in terms of manufacturing and transportation. No reason whatsoever as to why that would happen. The next is that the first argument is going to be Israel's friend. The east one here is that Netanyahu has openly criticized Obama in 2011 for elections for its refusal to meet with Israel, and the Prime Minister made it no secret that prefer Romney. However, the Obama trip to Israel today and Hagel's assurance of the funding of MD setting that relationship back in place. The east one here is the plan versus U.S.-Israel relations after the Gaza War in 2009. Chavez kicked out the Israel ambassador the same year that Maduro was acting as a foreign minister, and diplomatic relations with Palestine. In addition, Venezuela has increased diplomatic and economic cooperation with Iran. The east one here is that over the last year, Israel has grown increasing space in terms of the response to Iran proliferation, only constrained by U.S. This changes then it causes a preemptive strike. The next argument is a turn that makes us look like we are not focusing on our own debt to China because we no longer have the ability to pay back that debt, which is much greater probability. The next, though, is a turn that makes us look like we're self-interested for our own oil probability, that we just want to buy Venezuela off so we can take the oil for ourselves. The next argument is that their economy is actually high now because it's recovering, and new UN sanctions probably mean they're cooperating in this flow.
Two topicality arguments. Then the arguments on the background page. Then sorry, my flow got really messed up because I pulled a new sheet of paper and stuff at this end.
I did too, so that's what mine is.
Okay, great. Yeah, we'll figure it out. Okay, so let me just get this set up. Two topicality arguments. The Venezuela says no argument. And then I want the Venezuela relations to sound. And then I want the credibility, then I want advantage 1. Then the advantage 2. Well, I guess depending on how you have the advantage 2 arguments, I'll do advantage 1. And then I'll have the arguments starting from the Israel on down. And then I'll go to advantage to proper. And then the credibility arguments.
Can you do that again one more time?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Okay, so the topicality arguments in order. And then the background page. Then, and I have the background pages in, he says no, and the little politics argument there. And then the Venezuela relations dissent, then advantage 1. Then the Israel dissent arguments, and everything on that totally in order. Then advantage 2 proper, and then the credibility, carry credibility arguments.
Okay, now I figured it out.
What about the Venezuela dissent?
Yeah, that is right after the background.
Wait,
I had that first
The
dissent.
Venezuela dissent after the background.
Venezuela.
Yeah. TT background Venezuela.
I actually never dissent.
My topicality versus characterization that diplomatic engagement means the deployment of international aid. It means just the deployment of international aid. We need this because we deploy international aid. That this is to confirm the first argument is predictability. That this is actually what also is defined by the first argument is predictability. We have actually offers numerous times to other countries in order to pay down their deficits. We did this to Iraq in order to pay down. We also offered to pay down Greece in the Eurozone, indicating that this is the most predictable policy, but also this is the standard of bomb use as well as the National Security Council definition, which means that you are still going to get access to all of your arguments. Next argument is ground. It's always going to be better to have ground when we use what's most predictable for us, because that means you can be a better internal link to all of your goodness. And then the next argument is that this is absolutely central to our policy since in 2009. The International Security Council said that this was the cornerstone of diplomacy, but also you're always going to get better dissents in a world in which we just give aid rather than just when we just give financial arguments other than just talking to people. We're actually there's limits. I think that whatever limits most when the limits best, there's always going to be one topical verb in one of our plaintiffs, where is the world of your interpretation. There will be multiple topical plaintiffs, which means you would entirely you speak up and grab the next argument reasonability. So long as we can win one of arguments on your standards, there's no reason to vote against us. And potential visas, like we should never vote on potential visas. That would be like voting on potential advantage that solve all their offense, even though we're going to do that anyways. But that would be incredibly abusive. Venezuela. Counter. First argument is that Venezuela, Latin American country that is the receiver of the aid. Latin American country that is the receiver of the aid. We made this interpretation because we only give aid to Venezuela. We are just counting that. We are just saying that giving aid to Venezuela will also lead to external advantages for the United States. Next argument, the next argument on that one is that if our advantages are so effectual, it should be extremely easy for you to argue against them, since there has to be multiple steps in order for them to actually happen, which means you can get more arguments against them. The second argument is going to be ground. Our interpretation is always going to be better for background in the world in which we play. In the world in which we only claim one receiver, which means you still get access to all of your disadvantages, all of your disadvantages, as well as you get to access against Chinese aid. What?
We meet their interpretation. We offer it to Venezuela. We don't.
Yeah. Also, we need interpretation because we only offer aid to Venezuela. We don't offer aid to China. We just come to that engagement. The next argument is whatever limits are. You can cross the limit standards about how there will only be one topic plaintiffs in the world of our affirmative, but you can also provide the reasonability and potential abuse arguments. Background. Extend across all the arguments as to why Venezuela would say no. Relations. Venezuela says no to plaintiffs means that they never actually get aid. So we saw from the attack of the Venezuela law. We saw from the attack of the Venezuela dissent because we would make the girl look extreme popular because he would be showing us backlash and against the United States, which is all for the entirely of cooperation arguments. That would also mean that he would get the military behind him because he would show us standing up against the big bad United States even after Chavez's death, which we would entirely solve the internal link to all of your dissent arguments. The next argument, then once you see they're using this, I'll go down to the impact level. They just said this is key to Colombia. They just said that Maduro is key to mediating Colombian peace talks with FARC. This is not true. The Colombian peace talks actually ended within January when FARC lifted the unilateral ceasefire. Additionally, a couple days ago, FARC also set up a bomb in a major city and killed a bunch of people. Probably the reason is why peace talks aren't working out and never going to do so. Additionally, you can just extend across how he says no. It will always be better when she says yes. Advantage 1. Extend across how the IMF will always offer advantage 1. This means this argument doesn't matter, and it means that the plain text isn't necessarily key solving for it. There's no arguments. First argument is that the first thing is related to our action behind now. This is because not only do we get $1 billion of aid, but we're also increasing their national missile defense system, particularly after last fall when they came in attacking Hezbollah. The next argument is that turn Israel would actually like this because which other we're trying to they would just spin this off to everyone else as we're trying to like encircle their enemies and like get closer to their enemies in order so that we can protect Israel more. But the next argument that I want to say, Israel would absolutely never preemptively strike strikes because they would get shot down before it even happened. But additionally, Obama said that he would never, we would not defend them against the Israeli first strike, meaning that they would never backlash in a way. But the next argument instead of one is that Israel would never first strike because they know that that would lead to Russian retaliation, which would wipe out the face of the planet. Israel has a unique security guarantee. Israel has very unique security. Israel has very unique security concerns because they are such a small country, which means that they would never actually engage in a war with anyone unless they knew that they could have 100% United States backing. This is because any one nuclear weapon could wipe the country off and wipe the entire country off the face of the map. Probably the reason that's why this would never matter. But the next argument that I want to turn that increase in aid. Okay, the next argument that I want to turn the plan is obviously going to be better because it's just to prefer much more international aid, which means that Israel will probably just feel that they can have more sway for them to get more aid, which means that they're always going to like it. But the next argument that I want is that Israel would also like this because you are conceding the entire number two, the insurance system would actually help cooperation with China, which means that Israel would also be extremely happy because China is one of the biggest barriers and one of the reasons why we can't come to agreements on sanctions with Iran. So anyone which we can increase Chinese relations, Israel would also be happy by that by proxy. But the next argument that I want is that you say that this would make okay, they're China arguments. Going to the China arguments now where they say that China would like this because they feel that we are being self-interested. This is not true for a couple of reasons. The first argument is that the State Department offers money all the time. You can use cross arguments on top down as well as true, so let's see this normal. The second argument is that China actually wants the United States to keep our deals. This is because they like the fact that we are in debt to them because they think it gives us more influence over our policy, measures, particularly when we have things like a bigger military, which means that they look towards things like cheapest order to give them more sway. But the next argument is that the next argument was that the sheer size of our debt that we have to China is probably an indication as to why China isn't worried about us paying off our debt right now. But additionally, T-bills are a very unique form of debt. This is because you buy them and they have a very set maturity date, which means there's no way China's going to be worried about us paying them back because there is a very set time frame for us paying them back, and not at the same time that existed in this way. But the next argument is T-bills are also universally considered the most safest investment, which means that they would never backlash against it. All reasons as to why China would freak out. Advantage 2.
Wait, still number 4 argument that says offering a loan solves.
Yeah, I'm going to do that.
Okay.
All advantage 2. None of our solvency on advantage 2 is predicated off the fact that Venezuela actually has to accept the aid. It is all just predicated off the fact that we have to offer the aid to Venezuela. We predicted that you would just run that Venezuela would say no, and then we could link out of all of your politics. This is the proper reason as to why we're going to solve this. Extend across how United States and China relations are extremely low right now. Then extend across our apex where we really tell you that this is the only conflict that is actually going to build war. They cannot contest us anywhere within their arguments. This is always going to be the most probably enter to the round. Again, you can stick out your solvents about how just offering will be an entirely active debate. Additionally, offering it to Venezuela will also be very good to China because they'll think that we are willing to cooperate with people who we do not currently diplomatically engage in, which reasons why they would like us. But you can also extend across how this would solve for Japan because Japan would see that we're not going to just be unconditionally supportive to them, which means that we also stop Japan military middle, which means that we stop the entirety of an extinction level impact, which you could concede. What? Yeah, which you could concede. Credibility decided. Kerry's not key for a couple of reasons. The first argument is the first argument is that Kerry isn't key because it took forever for him to get, not only it took forever for him to get elected and approved by Congress, but the second argument is that Kerry is actually more key in places within the Middle East. It's because economic policies are not his specialty. This is why he doesn't have anything to do with them. But the third argument is that there are always going to be other diplomats who are going to be able to subsume any role that Kerry doesn't roll, any role that Kerry cannot fulfill. The fourth argument is that I want you to extend across how Venezuela says no. Anyone which Venezuela says no means that not only is Kerry's credibility not hard, but also means that any credibility loss will be subsumed by the fact that there will be absolutely no trade-off happening within our NATO relations. Reason is why we thought the next argument is that NATO cohesion is not actually key to Kerry. It is actually more key to our military defense, indicating that we can always back over the next argument is that the United States is not necessarily key to NATO cohesion. This is because we are always active with the NATO, which means that even if the United States didn't have good cohesion, the NATO would always be willing to check back from stopping Russia from taking over the Arctic. This argument is silly, but the next argument is that would drastically increase Kerry's credibility because you can see that we would solve for the entirety of the issue, which means that he would solve for Chinese relations, which solves the entirely to this dissent, and would solve better for NATO, which means the NATO would also like this. But the next argument that I want to say is the next argument is the EU debt collapse. The EU debt collapse is going to take a long time. There is a high propensity that this house will be able to slide back because other countries are still willing to bail out. Additionally, Russia does not because the Arctic. They just formed a new deal with ExxonMobil that they are increasing cooperation with the United States over our oil deals and with Venezuela, which is an indication as to why Russia would never go to war in this extinction.
Trump counted diplomatic engagement.
Yeah.
Judge Jack Rosemary does a piss poor job of answering the 1 and C shallows was written, particularly with regards to ground and the way that we limit the interpretation. Your only argument is you have a counter-interpretation, diplomatic engagement is international aid, but that is not competitive with our interpretation. The first argument is simply that you don't answer any of our limits arguments, which assert that you have to be all three because you would inflate the amount of ground that you affirmatively have in this debate. You make your arbitrary assertion that you are simply less broad and thus have fewer limits because you would make it so there's only one interpretation, but it is an arbitrary assumption of what your interpretation is. You should prefer our interpretation based on what the State Department's understanding of a broad category of diplomatic engagement is. This is absolutely critical because it creates a stable starting point for us to do our research coming into the debate, which is an argument conceded under the limits that the research ought to be prioritized in the NPTE because it's a unique environment where we can have depth of education, and at the point that you're saying the interpretation of limits most, limits best is going to be devastating. There's only a risk of offense to our interpretation. Most importantly, a permutation would not resolve this question because you still have not fulfilled any of those other issues. The two arguments that you have conceded the substance of the ground arguments, which you can contend right now that this is critical to core negative ground, including PICs, our focus disadvantages, and the TICs trade-off. They're making the argument that you would never vote on potential abuse, but I think there's a pretty good indication that the ground argument has impact in this debate at the point that their interpretation is that they are not a long-term engagement argument, that they do not resolve or allocate any of that focus. That is a cold no link that plays exactly into the interpretation debate we are having. They don't have any alternative causality arguments for why they would still be allowed that defense in the debate under our interpretation. Probably an indication that there is a reason to preference our interpretation on this question, and also once again that you have conceded the PIC argument that we ought to be able to pick out of one of the public diplomacy, communication, or international aid, which is critical to resolving any of the other abuses that might have happened in the debate in a moment. And the three, your only reason to prefer is a question of predictability that has been provided to other states. That is not an answer to the larger question we are raising about the limits that inform the predictability and our ability to understand what the State Department would mean. Just because there's been a recent trend of using international aid as a diplomatic action does not make you diplomatic engagement, which is a unique phrase, or that's your international aid that may be diplomatic engagement. It's not diplomatic engagement, it's a specific set of things. What's your question?
Yeah, can you give me an example of a topical affirmative?
That would use all three of these things simultaneously.
Yeah, that you establish a long-standing relationship with Venezuela involving ambassador exchange and, you know,
Ambassador exchange?
like, you give them...
like offering them something where they talk?
No, I mean,
And then have
that's fine.
And then we give them aid?
You don't have a we meet in this debate, so this is irrelevant.
Ambassadors international.
There is not a we meet in the MG.
There is also not a
Don't
topical
let them
affirmative you can
run
use.
it. Sure there is. That's not my job anyway, it's your job to find one. Look, let's be very clear. They have conceded the substance of the impact arguments. There is not a we meet. Don't let them grandstand on this. It's asinine. They no-linked all the scenarios because of this one-time action. That's the more important issue, is that it would be an establishment of a long-term engagement. That's what public diplomacy is. And they say Obama uses these all the time. Look, there's not an impact to this predictability argument in the context of everything else that happens. Because of the way that we assert that, you have to be a larger engagement. And five, that you say that this better affirmative ground makes you less predictable, which gives us stronger internal links. I have no clue what this means, but it doesn't sound like an answer. Particularly when we are isolating the exact problem is the expansion of affirmative ground, particularly when you can just say, go for the say no arguments and isolate the rest of those issues. And there's not a reason why lower predictability would be a better internal link to any of our disagreements. We isolate this as a question of link magnitude, the issue of how Kerry is going to be focused, for example, the example of how the relationship with the United States is going to implicate Maduro is incredibly important on this issue. More importantly, though, this seems to contradict your argument that you are, in fact, better for predictability, which creates a calculus that is going to be problematic for you. Either it is true that you are better for predictability, but then you still haven't answered any of the other arguments, and you're not giving us better ground, or you are totally unpredictable. You get to assert that you give better ground for some reasons that are absolute nonsense, but then we still have all these other offensive arguments that you absolutely cannot resolve. The sixth argument is that the link arguments are an exact demonstration of why your interpretation doesn't make sense. You can cross-apply all those now. You say that we get better links, that it's better than talking. Our argument isn't that it's just talking. Our argument is that it's all three, that it's a long-term general strategy of the way that we deal with these types of countries. The seventh argument is that you say whatever limits best, most limits best, but this is absolute nonsense. You, again, are only asserting that there's only one topical interpretation in the world of that there's only one topical affirmative in the world of your interpretation, but again, that is nonsense, if only because you are arbitrarily asserting that this is what it means in comparison to our limits argument, which is conceded, that says that you
You have exploded the ground by 3 times as much. The reason that this is the research question is important. We start from the basis of what that means, then we predict those 3 different things happening as a part of that. It would be impossible to come into a prep debate where you could just do any one of those 3 or none of those things, because it causes us to trifurcate prep time, which is also real abuse that would happen in the debate. It absolutely devastates depth, which is critical to both competitive equity and education. There are arguments that are conceded. Also, you say, potential abuse, something that would still be really abusive. Look, there is real abuse. Also, voting you down because you have a bad interpretation would not be abusive. It would indicate that you should have a better defense of your affirmative in the MG. 9. Our argument is that our ground and limits arguments are going to outweigh your really bad predictability argument because of the starting point for research. You can cross-apply all the reasons why that is true right now. Most importantly, the substance is the substance is the question. There's not a reason you have given us a better internal link. You are effectively doubling this thing, indicating that it's not true. 10, you say reasonability, that if you win, if we don't win all of our standards, we should lose. First of all, that's nonsense. To evaluate topicality as an offense-defense question. They don't solve any of the offense to the interpretation. They don't have a particularly compelling articulation of why they have offense to our interpretation. It doesn't make any sense. They don't have any defense to the interpretation because they haven't read a We Meet in the MG. You should ignore it in the PMR. That onus is on them. Just no chance you'd be ahead on this question. We absolutely are winning all of our limits, or all of our standards. It's whatever.
Okay, everybody good? Okay. Look, at the end of the day, this debate is really simple. There is not a weakness to our interpretation, which is devastating, because even if you're going to be comparing their counter-interpretation and their standards to our standards, we're going to be ahead. I want you to look to the ground argument in particular, where we highlight the picks, focus disads, and the links to politics which have been granted to us. This is not an answer coming out of Rosemary's speech, which is devastating to them, because even if she is right that it is much better for the affirmative, that is why topicality is a voting issue for the negative, because the AF can do whatever the hell they wanted and we would always lose. That is the premise of our ground argument, which goes conceded. You can extend that now, and it's probably the first reason why you can vote. On the limits, I think that we are ahead on this question as well. Their interpretation literally triples the number of affirmatives because they would have to do any one of these things and could do multiple ones. Our interpretation allows very specific interpretations. They make a joke about Ben because he can't think on his feet about what a topical affirmative is, but I think that his answer is good enough here. The argument that we could engage Venezuela in an ambassador exchange and get aid would meet that interpretation and would probably allow some of the links to the disad. This is where the potential abuse story comes into effect. Go to the U.S.-China relations if you want to look for particular abuse on this flow. The very first argument to the turn about it's going to be perceived that the United States is focusing not on their debt is not perceived because we give money all the time. That is probably potential actual abuse, but moreover, I think that we're ahead on the question of whether or not you have to have potential abuse. Obviously, we shouldn't have to read politics just so you can know link. It would be a massive time suck for the LOC. Go to their interpretation and their standards now. The arguments on ground is that it would be a better because we get internal links and financial arguments. Our argument about the perception of the way China would perceive the money is a financial argument. They no-link that argument. So even under their interpretation, we probably have no ground as well, which means that it's devastating for the negative's ability to compete in the debate. The next argument is just limits, and limits most, limits best. There is not an explanation as to why theirs would be the limiting to most factor. I think that our explanation in this shell coming out of the LOC, which is that they could literally engage in giving money to any country or organization that is tangentially connected to Venezuela, would mean that it infinitely delimits the topic, that there's no way that we'll be able to predict who they were actually offering the money to or for what purposes, which probably means that even if there was only one planned action, the amount of advantages that they would capture would be uniquely unfair and unpredictable. The only other defensive standards here are reasonability, which I don't think any judge on the circuit would buy. There is not a reason as to why you would look to reasonability or even what that that means. When you compare the interpretations, you can see that our interpretation is not only key to preserving negative ground, but probably also gives them better links to their China scenario. The only other argument is about potential abuse here. I think that I've already answered that argument above. At the end of the day, you can extend our interpretation. There is no we mean. You have to compare the standards that we give you coming out of the LOC and Ben expands on in the MO versus the standards that they give. There is only a question of ground and limits. They have fundamentally mishandled the ground argument, which is the most important because it theorizes that the negative would always lose. Even if they're right that it would expand at ground, we have preempt saying that is bad, which is probably the reason as to why you can vote them down. But I also think that they're behind on the limits. So for that, vote negative.
Okay. Topicality. Give me an overview. And then just straight down.
Alright. At the end of this round, your ballot will read that we are swapping them on the predictability arguments. They have conceded that we have three sources. This is Obama's stance, this is the National Security Council stance, and this is the Center of International Security stance on what diplomatic engagement means. If they are right about research is key, probably means that predictability is where research starts, because that indicates where you get your definitions. They gave absolutely no citation as to where any of their definition comes from. Probably means they just made it up. Which means we are going to have the inroads to ground and the limits, because that predictability is how you view ground and limits. Well, let's go there now. First, extend predictability. We have done this in the past with Iraq and Greece, when we tried to diplomatically engage them. They can see this argument, which means that if research is the starting point, you probably should have said, oh, international aid is the starting point. Additionally, you can extend how this is Obama's stance, this is national security stance. Then, under our ground standards, said that literally the Center of International Security said this was the cornerstone of diplomacy. You prefer predictability for a few reasons. One, that is the reason why you have ground. In Harley, you do not guarantee the type of ground that you want. Just because you run a disad does not mean that you get that disad. Does not mean you get that disad. As long as we are predictable and are reasonably predictable, because we have so many sources backing up our interpretation, it means that we are swamping you on this debate. Additionally, I think the point of information proves that there's absolutely no abuse in this argument, abuse on this argument, because they literally can't name an affirmative that would ever meet their interpretation. Probably means that if they're winning the limits, it's because they're zero. Yeah, that's probably a lesser limit, but we should at least have a few rather than none. Additionally, international aid is international aid. That is one affirmative. They literally just say public diplomacy, communication, and international aid. Wow, none of those indicate that that's one affirmative. None of that indicates that, which means that only in a world in which you just do international aid probably means that we are swamping you on the limits debate. Additionally, predictability assumes limits in ground, because if that predictability is the starting point of research, it's not ground. You determine your ground based off of what other people define diplomatic engagement is and what diplomatic engagement has done previously in the past. Probably means that we are swamping them on the research debate, in which they themselves says specifically at the NPTE is the #1 issue, which means that we are swamping them on this argument. Next, so I've answered the limits argument, I've answered their ground argument. We, first of all, you extend how we probably still have the same, if anything, limits is a complete wash, because we say just international aid. They say you have to do all three of these things, but they don't give you a single reason as to how international aid doesn't assume all of your communication and public diplomacy. I think the point of information arguments completely goes to our side as to why there's absolutely no abuse in this round. Next, I want you to extend how potential abuse is not a voter. He just tries to say that, oh, we know linked out of their carry politics. No, we know linked out of the carry politics because of all the reasons why you say no. We know linked out of your China arguments because we said there's a difference between T-bills and paying off Venezuelan debt. Not once did we say, oh, we're not doing public diplomacy and we're not doing communication, which means that none of your none of your arguments actually matter. Find that on the flow and maybe we lose. But we never once said that argument, which means there's absolutely no abuse in this round. Also probably means that we at least have a reasonable interpretation at the very least, which they conceded our reasonability standard, which means that we are always going to be far ahead on this tournament. Next, they try to, Next, look, at the end of this round, it's a pretty easy win for us because we are swapping on the predictability. Swamping them on predictability limits, which completely answers their limits, completely answers their ground, because the only way that you actually determine where the starting point of research is, determine the assumptions as to what the affirmative team is going to do, is whether or not what they're doing is predictable, which answers all of their prep abuse arguments as well, because prep abuse is based on what you think they're going to do. What you think an affirmative team is going to do is the definition of predictability, which probably means that we're swamping all of their prep abuse arguments as well. You ran a bad dissad that doesn't link to our affirmative because of the say no arguments and because you don't understand how T-bills works. Whoops, that is not an abuse argument, that's just a poorly run LOC. Probably means that we're swamping you on this division. Next, they try to say that, look, they go super hard for these limits arguments, super hard for these ground arguments. I think we're just winning that predictability is the starting point as to what limits are and to what the ground gets. Additionally, you can extend our number 2 argument that says we're probably ahead of ground because when you use predictability, then that means that you can determine which disads you get and which counterplans you get. They give no specific reason as to why they can't do like an alt-actor counterplan or anything like that. They give no reasons why these picks and their disads are so key even though we didn't actually abuse them. They didn't run their pick. There's no in-ground abuse. That's a pretty game over argument.
You guys okay if I record your RFD?